Elijah Turner was a retired Army veteran who lived a quiet life in the heart of the city. Every morning, he visited Lincoln Park, a small oasis surrounded by bustling streets. It was his favorite place to reflect on life and enjoy the simple pleasure of watching children play and listening to birds chirp. Despite his age, Elijah carried himself with dignity. He wore his veteran's cap proudly, a reminder of the years he spent serving his country. On this particular day, the park was alive with activity. Joggers passed by, families picnicked under the shade of large oak trees, and dogs played in the open field. Elijah sat on his favorite bench near the entrance, sipping coffee from his thermos. He smiled warmly at passersby, occasionally greeting those he recognized. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Elijah. He was a gentle soul, always ready with a kind word or a piece of advice. Officer Blake, a young police officer new to the precinct, was on patrol with his K-9 unit, Max. Blake was eager to prove himself, but his approach often came off as aggressive. As he drove by the park, he noticed Elijah sitting near the entrance. Something about the scene caught his attention. Max, the K-9, began barking loudly, startling the nearby families. Blake parked his car and approached Elijah. "Sir, can I ask what you're doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp and authoritative. Elijah looked up, surprised. "Just enjoying the morning, officer," he replied calmly. But Max continued to bark, pulling against his leash. Blake's voice grew more commanding. "Do you have any identification on you?" Elijah furrowed his brow. "Identification? I've been coming here every day for years. Is there a problem?" Blake's suspicion grew. He wasn't used to such direct responses, and Max's agitation only fueled his assumptions. A small crowd began to gather, sensing the tension. Elijah, sensing the situation escalating, stood up slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Officer, I'm a retired veteran. I mean no trouble." Blake misread the gesture. "Stay where you are," he shouted, tightening his grip on Max's leash. The barking grew louder, and the crowd murmured in confusion. A young woman nearby began recording the incident on her phone, sensing things were about to take a turn. Elijah stayed calm. "Officer, please, there's no need for this. I'm just an old man sitting in a park." But Blake's nerves were on edge. He saw Elijah's movements as threatening. Against the shouts of bystanders urging him to calm down, Blake released Max. The K-9 lunged forward, its teeth bared. Elijah tried to shield himself, but the attack came swiftly. The crowd screamed as the dog knocked him to the ground. Elijah cried out in pain as Max bit into his arm. "Call him off," shouted someone in the crowd. Blake hesitated, realizing too late that he overreacted. He pulled Max back, but the damage was done. Elijah lay on the ground, blood soaking through his sleeve. The video captured the entire incident, and within minutes, it was shared online. Unbeknownst to everyone, the man lying injured on the ground wasn't just a retired veteran. He was the father of Marcus Turner, the President of the United States, and this was just the beginning of a storm that would shake the nation. The video of the incident spread like wildfire across social media. In less than an hour, #JusticeForElijah was trending worldwide. People were shocked to see an elderly man, wearing a veteran's cap, attacked by a police K-9 in broad daylight. The comments poured in. Anger, sadness, and disbelief filled the online space. What kind of world allowed this to happen? Elijah, meanwhile, was rushed to the hospital. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening. As he lay on the hospital bed, nurses and doctors moved quickly to treat his wounds. Despite the pain, Elijah remained calm, his military training kicking in to help him endure. He thought of the young officer and his dog, wondering how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. At the White House, Marcus Turner, the President of the United States, was in the middle of a cabinet meeting when his chief of staff entered the room, looking pale. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "Sir, there's a situation involving your father." Marcus froze. His father, a man who rarely sought help and prided himself on his independence, had always insisted on living a simple life away from the spotlight. Marcus excused himself and followed his chief of staff to a private office. There, she showed him the video. The president's hands clenched as he watched the footage. Seeing his father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving the country, being treated like a criminal broke something inside him. "How did this happen?" he asked, his voice low but filled with controlled anger. His staff scrambled to gather information. Within minutes, they informed him of the officer's name, Blake, and that Elijah was at Lincoln Memorial Hospital. Marcus didn't waste time. He instructed his security detail to prepare the motorcade. "I'm going to see my father," he announced. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the press had already begun gathering outside. Reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving the building. Inside, Elijah was unaware of the chaos brewing. He was more concerned about the families who had witnessed the incident. They didn't need to see that, he told the nurse tending to him, especially the children. Officer Blake, on the other hand, was beginning to realize the gravity of his actions. Back at the precinct, his captain called him into the office. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the captain barked. Blake stood rigid, unsure of how to respond. "That man is the president's father," the captain continued. "This is going to be a national disaster." Blake's face turned pale. "I didn't know," he started, but the captain cut him off. "That's the problem. You didn't take a moment to think. Now the whole department is under scrutiny because of you." At the hospital, Marcus arrived, flanked by his security team. The crowd parted as he walked through, his face grim. Cameras captured every step, every expression. Inside, he found his father sitting upright in bed, a faint smile on his face. "Marcus," Elijah said warmly, as if nothing had happened. Marcus sat by his side, taking his father's hand. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked gently. Elijah chuckled. "You're the president, son. You've got bigger things to worry about." "Nothing is bigger than family," Marcus replied firmly. The two men talked quietly, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. Outside, the world waited. The president's next move would determine how this incident would shape the national conversation. Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As President Marcus Turner sat by his father Elijah's hospital bed, he felt a storm brewing inside him. Elijah, always calm and composed, tried to downplay the incident. "I'm fine, Marcus. Don't let this distract you," he said with a faint smile. But Marcus couldn't accept that. To him, this wasn't just about his father. It was about justice, respect, and what was right. "Dad, you've done so much for this country," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You deserve better than this. Everyone does." Elijah patted his son's hand and gave him a knowing look. "I know you'll do what's right," he replied. It wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge. Meanwhile, the news coverage of the incident had reached every corner of the country. From television screens to online platforms, people were glued to this shocking footage. Protests began to form outside the hospital, with citizens demanding accountability. Signs reading "Justice for Elijah" and "End Police Violence" were held high. Inside the precinct, Officer Blake sat in a state of disbelief. The video of his actions had gone viral, and his name was now synonymous with recklessness. His colleagues avoided eye contact, and whispers followed him wherever he went. It was an accident, he tried to explain to his captain, but the words felt hollow. "You need to understand something," the captain said sternly. "You didn't just hurt a man, you hurt a symbol. Elijah Turner is a veteran, a hero, and the father of the president. This isn't going away." Blake felt his world collapsing. "What do I do now?" he asked quietly. "You face the consequences," the captain replied. At the hospital, Marcus stepped outside to address the growing crowd. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him as reporters shouted questions. Marcus raised his hand to silence them. His expression was firm, his tone measured. "What happened to my father is unacceptable," he began. "But this isn't just about him. It's about the countless others who have faced similar situations but didn't have the privilege of their story being heard. This stops now." The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus continued, "I will ensure that justice is served, not just for my father, but for everyone who has been wronged. This isn't just about punishment, it's about change. We need better training, more accountability, and most importantly, compassion." Inside the hospital, Elijah watched his son's speech on the television. A nurse standing nearby said softly, "Your son is inspiring, Mr. Turner." Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "He always had a way with words," he said. As the speech ended, Marcus returned to his father's room. "You handled that well," Elijah said. "But now comes the hard part." Marcus nodded. "I know, but I'm ready." In the following days, Marcus announced a comprehensive review of police practices across the country. He assembled a team of experts, including law enforcement officials, community leaders, and activists, to create meaningful reforms. Officer Blake, meanwhile, was placed on leave pending an investigation. For the first time, he began to reflect on his actions. Sitting alone in his apartment, he rewatched the footage. He saw the fear in Elijah's eyes, the crowd's outrage, and his own careless decisions. It was a sobering moment. Elijah, despite his injuries, began to recover. He received countless letters and messages of support from strangers who thanked him for his service and expressed their anger over what had happened. "It's overwhelming," he told Marcus during one of their visits. "But it gives me hope. People care." The momentum for change was undeniable. The president's promise had struck a chord with the nation. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. True change wouldn't come from speeches or protests alone. It would require action, persistence, and unity. And he was ready to lead the way. The hospital room became a temporary command center for President Marcus Turner. Aides brought in briefings, Elijah's doctor monitored his recovery, and visitors from all walks of life came to show their support. Elijah Turner, though still in pain, smiled through it all. "I'm just an old man. I don't know why they're making all this fuss," he joked. But Marcus knew better. His father's humility only strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, news stations buzzed with updates on the incident. Debates broke out about systemic issues in law enforcement. Some defended Officer Blake, saying it was a mistake, while others called for immediate accountability. Across the country, the name Elijah Turner became a symbol of resilience and dignity. Communities started sharing their stories, and the nation began to listen. Marcus wasn't just listening, he was acting. He called for an emergency summit on police reform. Leaders from various fields were invited, including law enforcement officials, community activists, and legal experts. Marcus addressed them with urgency. "This isn't just about one incident," he said firmly. "It's about rebuilding trust, ensuring accountability, and making our system work for everyone." Back at the police precinct, Officer Blake faced mounting pressure. His colleagues distanced themselves, and the investigation into his actions was underway. Captain Reynolds, a veteran officer with a reputation for fairness, met with him. "Blake, you're at a crossroads," the captain said. "You can either defend yourself blindly or reflect and take responsibility." Blake felt conflicted. The weight of public outrage was heavy, but so was his growing guilt. He decided to meet with a counselor, seeking clarity. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," he admitted during a session. "But now I see the fear I caused. I see the pain." For the first time, Blake began to understand the depth of his actions. At the same time, Marcus reached out to police unions and community leaders to foster dialogue. He knew that true change required collaboration. "We need to stop seeing each other as enemies," he said during a roundtable discussion. "This is about protecting and serving every citizen, no matter who they are." Elijah, despite his recovery, insisted on being part of the process. "Let me help, Marcus," he said. "I've seen this country at its best and worst. People need to see us working together." Marcus agreed, knowing his father's voice carried weight. Together, they recorded a public message, urging unity and understanding. In the video, Elijah spoke candidly. "I've served this country because I believe in its potential," he said. "But potential means nothing without action. Let's work together to create a system that treats everyone with respect and dignity." The video went viral, sparking nationwide discussions. Communities organized town halls to discuss policing and justice. Families shared stories of their interactions with law enforcement, some positive, others painful. The collective call for change grew louder. Amid these efforts, Marcus met with the legal team overseeing the investigation into Blake's actions. "We're not here for revenge," Marcus said. "We're here for justice. That means accountability and learning from our mistakes." Blake, aware of the investigation's progress, made a surprising decision. He requested to meet with Elijah. The request shocked everyone, including Marcus, but Elijah agreed. "If he wants to talk, I'll listen," he said. The meeting took place in a private room at the hospital. Blake entered, visibly nervous. Elijah, seated but composed, gestured for him to sit. "Why did you want to see me?" Elijah asked. Blake struggled to find the words. I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I see the harm I caused. And I'm sorry." Elijah studied him for a moment. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "But apologies mean nothing without action. What will you do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Blake didn't have an immediate answer, but he nodded. "I'll find a way," he promised. The meeting marked a turning point, not just for Blake, but for the broader movement Marcus was building. The path to change was difficult, but the nation was beginning to believe it was possible. Elijah's meeting with Officer Blake became a focal point of national news. The images of the two sitting face to face, one a victim of a terrible incident, the other a man struggling to atone, captured the public's imagination. The conversation was brief but profound, and its ripple effects began to show. Elijah's calm demeanor and insistence on action over empty words struck a chord with millions across the country. Marcus Turner watched the coverage from his office. His father's resilience inspired him, but he knew that inspiration alone wasn't enough. "We need more than words," he said to his team. "We need change that people can feel in their everyday lives." Plans for a sweeping police reform bill were already underway, and Marcus made it clear that this was just the beginning. Elijah, now discharged from the hospital, returned to his home, but it was far from a quiet recovery. Calls flooded in from people wanting to share their support or tell their own stories. Churches, schools, and community organizations reached out, asking Elijah to speak. "They think I'm a hero," Elijah said to Marcus during a phone call. "But I'm just a man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." "You're more than that, Dad," Marcus replied. "You're a symbol of what we're fighting for." Meanwhile, Officer Blake faced a whirlwind of emotions. His public apology was met with mixed reactions. Some appreciated his willingness to own up to his actions, while others saw it as too little, too late. Blake wasn't looking for sympathy, though. He began attending workshops on racial bias and community policing. "I can't undo what I did," he said to his counselor, "but I can work to make sure I never harm anyone like that again." At the same time, protests and rallies continued to grow. Signs with messages like "Justice for Elijah" and "Accountability" now filled the streets. Families brought their children, hoping to teach them about the importance of standing up for what's right. Music and speeches echoed through the air, creating a sense of unity and purpose. Marcus attended one of these rallies, stepping onto the stage to address the crowd. "This isn't just about my father," he said. "It's about the countless people who have faced injustice and didn't have the chance to tell their story. It's about making sure no one else has to endure what he did. Together, we can build a better future." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Marcus knew the real work would take place behind closed doors. Meetings with lawmakers, police unions, and community leaders were tense but productive. Marcus pushed for transparency and accountability measures, including body cameras and better training programs. "If we're going to ask people to trust the system," he said, "we need to give them a reason to." Amid all this, Elijah found himself reflecting on his role in the movement. He decided to join Marcus at a town hall meeting in their hometown. The room was packed with neighbors, friends, and even some former critics. Elijah took the microphone and spoke from the heart. "I've lived a long life," he began. "I've seen this country at its best and its worst. But what keeps me hopeful is seeing all of you here today, willing to make things better." The room fell silent as Elijah recounted his experience. He didn't dwell on the pain or fear, but instead focused on the lessons learned. "We have to see each other as human beings," he said, "not as enemies, not as strangers, but as people who all want the same thing, a chance to live with dignity and respect." As Elijah finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Marcus couldn't help but smile as he saw his father's words bring people together. It was a reminder of why they were fighting so hard. Back at the precinct, Captain Reynolds took note of the growing calls for reform. He held a meeting with his officers, emphasizing the need for change. "We're here to serve the community, not to intimidate or harm it," he said. "Let's start acting like it." Officer Blake sat quietly in the back, listening intently. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the system he had been a part of. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. The momentum was building, and Marcus knew they had to keep it going. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, progress felt possible. Elijah Turner sat on his front porch, his cane resting against the wooden railing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His neighborhood was quiet, but the world beyond seemed louder than ever. News channels still replayed clips of his story, and his name had become a rallying cry for justice. Yet Elijah remained humble. "I'm just an old man trying to live his life," he told a reporter over the phone earlier that day. Meanwhile, Marcus Turner was in Washington, D.C., fighting battles of his own. He stood in a packed conference room, addressing lawmakers and community leaders. "My father's experience is not unique," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. "It's a painful reality for many. We need systemic change, and we need it now." The proposed reform bill, which Marcus had poured his energy into, was gaining traction. It aimed to increase police accountability, mandate body cameras, and provide better training programs to address racial bias. But progress was slow. Debates were heated, and opposition was strong. Still, Marcus pressed on, fueled by his father's resilience. Back in their hometown, Officer Blake was undergoing his own transformation. After his heartfelt apology to Elijah, he had thrown himself into learning and unlearning. He attended workshops on empathy and racial sensitivity, often feeling out of place but determined to change. "This isn't about redemption," Blake said to a colleague. "It's about being better for the people we serve." Elijah, unaware of the details unfolding around him, decided it was time to step out of his home. He joined Marcus at a town hall meeting organized by the community. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds. Some carried signs reading, "Justice for Elijah," while others wore shirts that said, "Change starts here." When Elijah took the stage, the crowd fell silent. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "I've seen many years in my life," he said, his voice steady. "I've lived through good times and bad, but what happened to me wasn't just bad, it was wrong. And it's still happening to others. That's why we're here today." Elijah shared his story, not in anger but with a quiet strength that moved everyone in the room. He spoke of the fear he felt that day, the pain of being treated unfairly, and the hope he had for the future. "I don't want this to be about me," he said. "I want it to be about us, about making sure no one else has to go through this." The audience erupted in applause, some wiping away tears, Marcus stepped forward and hugged his father, grateful for his courage. "You've always been my hero," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. The town hall sparked more conversations. People stayed long after the event ended, discussing ideas and sharing their own experiences. It was a small but powerful moment of unity. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds called a meeting at the precinct. He addressed his officers, his tone serious but hopeful. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can change how we move forward. It's time we rebuild trust with the community we're supposed to protect." Blake stood in the back, listening intently. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the badge. He approached Reynolds after the meeting. "I want to help," he said, "whatever it takes." The movement was growing, but it wasn't without its challenges. Protests continued across the country, some peaceful, others not. Social media buzzed with opinions, both supportive and critical. Yet, amid the noise, Elijah's story remained a beacon of hope. As the night fell, Elijah sat with Marcus on the porch. They watched the stars, their conversation quiet but meaningful. "You've done so much, Dad," Marcus said. "More than you realize." Elijah smiled, his heart full. "We've done it together," he replied. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Elijah Turner woke up to the soft sound of birds chirping outside his window. The world felt lighter, as if it was finally catching up to the change he had long hoped to see. Marcus had flown back home the previous night, bringing news that the proposed reform bill had passed its initial stages. It was a small victory, but a significant one. That morning, Elijah decided to take a walk. The streets felt different. Neighbors waved warmly, and even people he didn't know smiled at him. His story had reached far beyond their small town, and the community seemed to carry a renewed sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure their town became a place where everyone felt safe and respected. Marcus joined his father on the walk. The two strolled through the park, talking about the changes they had seen over the past weeks. "You've inspired so many people, Dad," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "Even me." Elijah chuckled. "I just told the truth," he replied. "The rest was up to everyone else." As they walked, they passed a group of young children playing basketball. One of the boys ran up to Elijah, holding a small notebook. "Mr. Turner, can I have your autograph?" the boy asked shyly. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Of course," he said, signing the notebook with a steady hand. The boy beamed and ran back to his friends, who all waved enthusiastically. At the police station, change was slowly taking root. Captain Reynolds had implemented new training programs focused on community engagement and de-escalation techniques. Officer Blake, now one of the program's most active participants, had become a surprising advocate for change within the department. He often spoke to his colleagues about his own mistakes, encouraging them to see their roles through a different lens. Blake even reached out to Elijah, asking if he could join him on his walks through the neighborhood. At first, Elijah was hesitant, but he saw the sincerity in Blake's eyes. "All right," Elijah said one day. "But you better keep up. I don't slow down for anyone." The sight of the two walking together became a symbol of reconciliation for the community. People began to believe that change was possible, not just through legislation, but through understanding and human connection. One evening, the town organized a community dinner at the park. Tables were set up under the open sky, filled with food, laughter, and conversations. Elijah and Marcus sat at the center table, surrounded by neighbors, activists, and even a few officers from the precinct, including Blake. As the sun set, Marcus stood up to address the crowd. "This isn't just about my father's story," he began. "It's about all of us coming together to create a better future. We've taken the first steps, but the journey isn't over. Let's keep walking it together." The crowd erupted in applause. Elijah looked around, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, but he was thankful for the path it had carved out. As the dinner wound down, Marcus and Elijah sat quietly under the stars. "What's next for you, Dad?" Marcus asked. Elijah thought for a moment, then smiled. "I think I'll keep walking," he said. "There's still a lot to see, a lot to learn, and a lot to teach." The two sat in silence, the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was a better one. And that was enough for now. And so, Elijah's journey continued, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of standing up for what's right.